G'day guys, today I'm installing a Viofo dashcam and I've gone with the A119 V3. I'll be going over why I went with that instead of some other options on the market which originally were my first choice, but I got steered away from them when I looked into it a little bit more. So I'm going to be going over that, the weights, the costs. I'll go over the power draw of the camera. We'll be hardwiring it. It won't be done via a USB socket. We don't want cables showing, we want everything neat and tidy. I'm going to go over how to do a firmware update, some footage at different resolutions, a few of the different menu items and how I set the camera up, as well as obviously the full install and mounting to the windscreen. So as I mentioned, I've gone with the Viofo A119 V3 and there's a few reasons for this. What I was looking for in a camera was I only wanted one camera. I didn't want any of these package deals that come with 2 cameras and 3 cameras. I was only interested in the dash camera. I wanted the footage to work with a micro SD card that I could just pull straight from the unit into a laptop, because I might want to use that footage for other videos, not just in case there's an incident. I wanted it to work with SD cards that I already had. I didn't want any company that was trying to sell their own SD cards. I wanted it to be lightweight, simple. I wanted it to be hidden from the driver's position. I wanted to be able to hardwire it in, and the main thing for me was that it didn't overheat. So I ended up with the Viofo A119 V3, even though it wasn't the first thing I was looking at. This is not a high priority thing for me. This was quite a low priority thing, but I thought I would install one anyway in the case of an accident, but also on the off chance that I might want to pull that footage to use in a video of some other kind. So I wanted something with decent enough quality, but with dash cameras, you are limiting yourself to quite small sensors and you're not going to get amazing footage. Now my first choice was actually the Nextbase 622GW, which I'll show you now. So this is the Nextbase 622GW. This is what I was going to buy, but it is about $400 more expensive than what I ended up purchasing. It does look good and it has a larger sensor, but the main thing that I wanted it for was the image stabilization and the better image that it does give because of its larger sensor. So this looks like a really good option, but there were a lot of reports in the forums like Dashcam Talk about this unit overheating in climates such as the UK. So I just didn't think it would be up to the Australian climates, and a lot of reports of it freezing when it does overheat. So there's no reason for me to pay $400 extra for something that's not actually going to work reliably, even though the image when it does work would be better than what I'm going to get from the one that I did buy. All these other features that they advertise as if they're a good thing, like voice control and Alexa, they don't mean anything to me. In fact, I'd rather they didn't exist at all. I don't want to control things through phone apps. I don't want Alexa, don't want voice control. I just want a set and forget. All of this stuff is just stuff you have to pay for that I have no interest in actually using. So I was drawn to this because it featured in a lot of reviews, a lot of lists, had it as the #1 dash cam. But when I looked a bit further into it, I found out that it had a lot of overheating issues. It's obviously not cooling well enough, trying to pull a 4K image. Although the image stabilization and the built-in polarized filter did look really good, it was also a very bulky item and cost about 3 or 4 times more than the Viofo did in the end. I did also briefly consider the Blackvue DR900X range, which we'll just have a quick look at now. Now Blackvue have a really good reputation and they have a large range of cameras, but I've seen test footage of these and the 4K footage really doesn't look that much better than a lot of the smaller resolution cameras out there. I had no interest in all these packages that come with 2 or more cameras, and I had seen a lot of reports on these freezing up with the software not working with other SD cards, only working with their SD cards. The DR900X Plus is the flagship model, but look at that price for $679. I think these are great cameras, but it's just not worth that for me for quite a low priority item. I just won't get that sort of benefit out of it. I would have gone with the Nextbase before I went with this one. There are lots of other dash cams available. Garmin's a popular one. The best thing about these is that the reviews state that they are very reliable and they just work and they are nice and simple, so I was considering these as well. But I'm not going to pay this sort of money for something when I feel like I can get something 8/10 as good for about a quarter of the cost. Now again, these probably work for a lot of people, but you also get a lot of complaints about these things freezing, not being able to access footage, needing to use that company's SD cards, and you're paying in excess of 3 or 4 times what you pay for the Viofo. Now the Viofo that I did get isn't 4K, but 4K is not what's going to make the difference between you reading a license plate or not. That is all to do with shutter speed, which can't be controlled on any of these cameras. You can change your frame rates and you can change your resolutions, but you can't actually change the shutter speed. It's all automated. So 4K started to look more of a burden in the processing and the heat generated, and the fact that these systems would overheat and freeze and need resetting. I just wanted something simple that worked. I wasn't interested in voice control. I wasn't interested in built-in Alexa integration. I wasn't interested in it having a phone app. I didn't actually want it to have a phone app at all. I just wanted to control it from the unit. I wanted it to be neat and tidy, hardwired, small, hidden behind the rear view mirror. And because this wasn't a high priority job for me, I was more than happy to go for a less expensive option. So just a note on Viofo, they do offer higher range cameras as well. They're not all budget cameras, but they have a great selection of different cameras. This is the one that I went with, the A119 with the GPS module. You don't necessarily have to buy from here. The GPS module makes it $159, but if you look at Amazon, you've got $133.44. Now, it might be a little bit more expensive with the GPS module, but this is a very, very popular dash cam with a lot of good reviews. Considering the amount of ratings that it has, the price is brilliant for the features that you get. And this is the sort of camera that I wanted. It has all the features that you need and they work properly. It doesn't have all these unnecessary features that just cause software issues and firmware issues and cause the camera to bug out and crash. So that's a lot of the reason why I went with this. Is it is popular, it works, I can change the bit rates and the resolutions, and it is nice and small and lightweight. The Nextbase, which I originally did want, is a little bit bigger and bulkier, but I think one day I might try this. If for some reason the Viofo fails, I will look at something like this and just test it out in the Australian conditions, see how it lasts. But I didn't want to cough up these sorts of money straight off the bat. I'll give them a chance to fix up their firmware and all that first. I'll put links to all of these down in the description, but this is the one that I would recommend for most people, just given the price and the features that you get for it. However, in an ideal world, this is the one I would have liked to have tested out, and then this one, I think it's a little bit overpriced. So with the latest firmware update, I've actually just found out it does record a different type of 4K. It's not a proper 4K. Doesn't have a large enough sensor, but it does offer a different range of resolutions. I can change the loop recording, which is handy if I want to look through less files when I'm actually using the footage, not for an incident, but just in general. I can change the bitrate to get the highest bitrate and the best quality video possible. It records audio, has a built-in display just so you can see where you're setting your camera up. So it kind of ticked all the boxes. It was nice and cheap, even with the GPS module that I got. So I think it's important you don't get upsold with all this 4K stuff, because you're not going to be able to improve the shutter speed on these 4K images. The only time it would help is if you're trying to crop in on a stationary car or a stationary object or something like that. Obviously, more resolution will allow you to crop more, but it doesn't actually improve the speed at which you can capture detail. So if we look at the box for the A119 V3, got some instructions. This is the unit itself. Now this one came with a GPS module, so we will plug the power into this GPS module instead of into the side. And that is just a sliding clip. You see you got your contacts there, slide it in. This is what we stick to the window. Camera, angled screen to make sure you set your angles up right. And these are electrostatic stickers. You stick these to the windscreen, then you stick the actual camera to these. That way you can peel it off and re-stick them on without making a mess of the windscreen. This is the ordinary mount. If you don't want to use the GPS module, you just clip this in instead of that. You get 2 of these, so you can have this installed in 2 cars, the actual mount, and you can just move the camera. These clips are just to run any cabling. This is a micro to A USB, both outdated types of USB, but for some reason that's what they send it with. This short cord is for taking data off, putting it onto a laptop, for example. This long cord is the power. This is your power adapter. So it's just a 6-socket connection, but it is also a dual USB charger. So basically it drops from 12 volt to USB power, which is 5 volt. But for me, I'm not using this. I want everything hardwired and neat and tidy. So I'll be using an existing voltage converter that I have in the roof lining. That's basically all it comes with. This is a polarizing filter. So this will just clip on the lens to reduce glare. Alright guys, we're going to go through the install now, and I am hardwiring this with a step down transformer that converts it to USB power, because the unit was normally supplied by that 6 socket we saw in the box that converted it down to 5 volts. Now I already have one of these in the roof lining because I did this for the reverse camera, which is also USB powered. It has a maximum output of 2 amps. I've measured the current draw on the existing one at about 1 amp, and I expect this Viofo to be a lot smaller than that, so I'm happy enough to run the 2 off the 1 step down transformer. This transformer cost me about $20 from JCar, but you can find them on Amazon. If I find a good one, I'll link it down below, and it should be able to run both of these dash cams with no issues. So although we have no use for this during the operation because it's ugly and we're going to hardwire it, it is handy to test it. So if you were unsure, for example, where you wanted to mount your unit, or even more importantly, just test it before you install it. For example, I'll be testing that the GPS module power works through there. So we have a light coming on. Just turn it on. It might take a while the first time. Okay, so I'm just going to insert a micro SD card to stop the beeping. So we'll run through the settings in a second. The reason that has a blue tint on it is just because of this protective cover on the lens. So we'll leave that on until we are happy with the rough placement of it. I was more interested in whether it actually powered through this GPS module, which it is. To make it nearly invisible from the driver's seat, I'll have it up here somewhere. Before I stick it on, I'll just put these covers on so I know that these aren't going to get in the way when I try to stick it to the windscreen. So I am going to set the position with the power on. I have the cable plugged in just so I can sort of try and figure out how the cable is going to be run. From the driver's position, it will be hidden behind the mirror and the cables will run up into this plastic cover. So I can use the black on the windscreen as a rough guide. That is roughly what it will look like, where it will be mounted. So I'm just going to clean it, use a microfiber towel to dry it, and then use these electrostatic stickers. And then we'll peel off the GPS module sticky back and we'll stick that on. Now we just hold it on firmly for a few seconds. So we're pulling the power now. Going to go disconnect the battery, and then I can cut this and make this a hardwire connection into this step down voltage transformer. Now with that battery disconnected, we are safe to chop these without blowing the fuse. Just make this notch a little bit bigger, so we've got 3 cables coming out of there now. So this cable has a screen, tape that back. So that step down voltage transformer that I'm reusing has a 2 amp maximum output. With both cameras on, we're only getting about 1.48 amps. Polarized filter, we have a screen to take off. There's a screen on the inside as well. And this just clips over the lens. That is your basic setup. When I installed this, I was actually going through the menu and I realised it wasn't the latest firmware. So I'm just going to quickly go over how I updated the firmware, and then we'll run through the menu items. I'm not going to go into detail on every menu item, but I'll just quickly go into a couple that I changed and explain why I set them the way I did. So I got a blank micro SD card and I got this firmware from the website, and then I just put that .bin file onto the SD card. Now you can see that they ask you to format the card to FAT32. The card that I put it on was EX-FAT and it worked just fine. So I took the old card out, put the new one in, and then powered up, and it sits there for a minute and then it will switch on like this. That's the firmware done. Press record button to get to the menu, otherwise the menu button will be a screenshot. Check the firmware version, and 2.6, that's the most modern one with a few new resolutions to choose from. There they are, the 3440 and the 2880, which we'll look at a little bit later on. But there are a few new options and you'll see the resolution change on the screen there. That's just an example, so if you want to go through them, you can see what they look like on the camera. Next we got bitrate. Now this comes from factory on medium. I'm going to change it to high because I don't care about the storage space. I just want the highest quality video possible. After that, loop recording, you got 1, 2, 3, 5 and a 10-minute option. 3 is fine for me. I go MP4 format, so it plays better with the computers. The exposure I'm going to leave on 0 and I'll just play with it from there, see what it looks like. HDR, definitely want that off. The parking mode, I'm going to have that on an event, so if it senses that it's been hit, it'll turn on for a little bit. And then the sensitivity for it all, I'm going to put it sort of roughly in the middle. I don't want nuisance recordings, so I'll just leave it on middle sensitivity and see how everything goes there. Motion detection I've turned off, GPS on because I'm using that module, speed kilometers per hour. And then the G sensor I'll change to low. This is the one that locks files so they won't be written over in case of an accident. I don't want it being overly sensitive. Now I turned off the date stamp, the GPS info stamp and the camera model stamp. This just overlays image on top of the footage, but because I might be using this footage in other scenarios, I've gotten rid of that. The alternative is that I can go a different aspect ratio with the date stamp and camera stamp at the bottom and then just crop in to get rid of that later. Now audio recording I've definitely got on because it's useful for saying things to the camera. For example, if I was traveling around, I can say where I am and then I'll remember when I'm editing the footage. It's also good if you have an incident, you can read out the license plate number because the cameras will not pick up the license plate numbers unless things are stationary or moving very slowly. So if you read it out, then you have that on the audio to go back and look over. Now I'll just breeze through the rest. You got your date and time zones, beep sound, I turned it off, frequency 50 Hz for Australia, doesn't really matter to be honest. Image rotation, that's where you format your memory cards, and there's your firmware version. Boom. Just in case you're interested, the card that I took out that had been formatted in the unit does change to FAT32. So if you do want to change one to FAT32 for the firmware, just take one out that's been formatted by the unit itself. Alright, so for the test footage, I'm not going over everything, I'm just going to cover 3 different options here. One is the 1920 by 1080, just at 60 frames per second, just to show you how the slow motion looks when you slow the footage down. The next will be the newest option, which is the 4K. They call it cinematic look because it thins out what it is actually showing you. They claim that this helps with the exposure because you're not exposing for the sky and the dash and you're just getting more of the road. And the last one will be the native resolution, which is the 1440p at 30 frames per second. So the first bit of footage, I'm going to compare the 4K to the 1080. Now the 4K is not a real 4K. The sensor isn't big enough for 4K. It is upscaled using 4K switches to H.265 compression. The 1080 I've done at 60 frames per second because I just want to show you what the slow motion looks like, but I won't be using 1080 footage. I just thought it might be easier on the processor. So here's 1080 footage, 60 frames per second, and you can slow it down like this, but it's still pretty muddy footage, not very good clarity. Here it is back at normal speed. And even when you're going slow, like I'm doing 30, those cars may be doing 15, it's really hard to read license plates. So anything over about a 50 kilometer difference in speed. This is 4K footage now. You can see the letterbox up the top and bottom. That is done for you. Back to the 1080 for comparison, and then back to the 4K. The 4K does look neater, but again, these sensors are so small, you're never going to get great quality video. Now, there's a couple other settings you can change. 2560 by 1440 is what I would consider the normal aspect ratio, but you can get the 4K image here, which is upscaled. You can also get this 2160, which is the same aspect ratio as the 1440, but it is upscaled. Just a comparison, 4K, 2160, and 1440 footage. So depending on what aspect ratio you want, you can switch between them, find whatever suits you. So let's just see how difficult it is to read license plates. Even from about 20 meters back, you will struggle to make it out clearly. But if you get a little bit closer, then I'll pause this when the license plate becomes properly clear. Like at the moment, you can arguably read it, but about this distance here, you could say that it is actually clear. And we'll just zoom out and see how far away we are. It is about 10 meters to 15 meters away. Now I'll just show you the aspect ratios with the car parked in the garage, so you have straight lines and you can see how the image is affected and stretched and cropped in. We'll start with 2560 by 1600. I think this is the native for the sensor. This works out as a 16:10 ratio, which is fairly common. but the 2560 by 1440 16:9 ratio is probably the most common. You can see it crops in a little bit at the top and bottom. 4K is a 21:9, sort of a cinematic look, crops in a lot of the dash and sky, it all crops out. With this 2880 by 2160 is the same aspect ratio, 16:9, as the 1440p. It just uses H.265 compression instead, but the aspect ratio is exactly the same. I'm leaning towards the 4K to stick with that, or going with the 2160, adding in the date and GPS information to the bottom and just cropping in when I want to get rid of that information. So you can see all the differences there in quality. All of that is unedited. It does come out quite saturated and stuff. That's just the way it comes off the camera. So I was able to pull that SD card out, put it into the laptop. There was no transcoding needed. It's already in MP4, so it was easy to upload into Final Cut Pro, for example. So I might chop and change between the 4K and the 1440. It is a dash cam. I don't mind the wider view, including the dash and the sky. So with the 1440, you did have the option to go 60 frames per second there. I am going to go with 30 frames per second instead of 60 frames per second, which I think will give better quality at night because it allows the shutter speed to lengthen up to at least 1/30th of a second and get as much light in as possible. But I just want to say that 60 frames per second is not the same as increasing your shutter speed. So you're not going to get less blur, you'll just have more frames to play with within a second. So I'm going to stick with 30, probably the 1440p, maybe the 4K on occasion, but I think most of the time will be the 1440p. It is less taxing on the CPU because it's less frames per second, and it should reduce any risk of this unit overheating. Alright, so if you're interested in the weights, the dash cam with the CPL filter is added 118 grams. I've gone through and weighed everything on the scales. We used about 4 grams worth of crimps, which is going to make a massive difference on the fuel economy. Now also in this video, I'm just including the weight of an RCA cable that I've pre-run in to a head unit that I'm returning, but that cable will be permanent, so we'll stay there. I'm just adding that weight and cost to the end of the video, just so that is logged and I don't have to think about it later. Alright guys, that's it for the dash camera install. We've hardwired it, we've seen the power draw, we know it doesn't add much weight, it's nice and cheap, it works as it should. You've got a few resolutions to play with. If you get rid of the overlay of the date and time, the speed and GPS info, you can use that image in a pinch for a travel video, for example. It's a small sensor camera, so it's not going to be amazing, but it's not too bad. Straight out of camera, you can make that work with other footage. So overall, I'm very happy with that. I'm glad I didn't pay extra for these cameras that seem to have a lot of issues and offer a lot of features that I'm really not interested in. This is just a bang for buck option that just works. It's simple, I can't even see it. All the cables hidden behind the rearview mirror plastics. So now I just forget about it and it keeps loop recording. And every now and then I'll pull that micro SD footage out just to have a look at it if I'm driving through an interesting place. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. The reason that has a Bluetooth model with all these features, which I'll show you the test, because phone app, I was not at all interested, but when I looked a bit, I did also briefly consider and in theory let the maximum amount of light footage because it leaves hardwired it. It's hard, too bad either, just a slot.